Bonjour à tous et bienvenue au colloque Façons de regarder, manières d'interpréter, François Lissarrague, un parcours d'images qui ouvre aujourd'hui dans l'auditorium de l'INHA. Je suis Cécile Colonna, conseillère scientifique à l'INHA, et je prends la parole pour ce mot de bienvenue à la place d'Éric de Chasset, le directeur de l'Institut national d'histoire de l'art, qui vous prie de bien vouloir excuser son absence aujourd'hui. Il aurait été très heureux d'ouvrir avec Cecilia d'Ercole ce colloque. François Lissarrague, disparu brusquement il y a 2 ans, a dédié sa vie de chercheur à l'étude des images de la Grèce antique et au-delà. Ce colloque organisé en sa mémoire souhaite revenir sur son apport novateur à l'histoire de l'art antique, comme à l'étude des collections de vases grecs et de leur longue histoire. Les interventions de ses collègues, étudiants et souvent amis témoigneront de la place de ses travaux et de l'influence de ses méthodes dans des branches variées de la recherche historique. L'idée de ce colloque a été initiée par son ami très proche de longue date et collègue de travail, Alain Schnapp, qui fera l'introduction du colloque dans quelques instants. Ce colloque a été organisé donc en collaboration entre plusieurs institutions, l'INHA et le centre de recherche ANIMA, également avec le HESS et avec le soutien de Paris 1 et leur ARCAL, Archaeological Challenge, dirigé par Ara Procopiou, et avec le soutien de Madame Adrienne Lézy-After. Ce colloque a été organisé avec un comité scientifique international que nous tenons à remercier chaleureusement pour son implication et ses conseils pour bâtir le programme qui vous est aujourd'hui proposé. Comme vous l'avez vu, nous aurons beaucoup d'intervenants durant ces 2 jours et demi, une trentaine d'intervenants ainsi que de nombreux présidents de session. Malheureusement, quelques-uns n'ont pas pu être avec nous dû à des contretemps. Nous aurions également aimé inviter bien plus de collègues à participer au colloque, puisque François avait travaillé avec beaucoup de monde en France et à l'étranger. Mais malheureusement, nous avons été contraints par des considérations financières et logistiques. Les participants viennent de Grèce, d'Italie, de Suisse, d'Allemagne, de Belgique, du Royaume-Uni, et leurs horizons très variés témoignent de la diversité de ces sujets d'études et de l'étendue de ces réseaux. Je ne vais pas m'étendre ici sur la carrière scientifique de François Lissarrague, que nos différents intervenants auront l'occasion de présenter et d'évoquer à de nombreuses reprises, mais je voulais souligner les liens forts et anciens qui ont uni François Lissarrague et l'INHA. Il a en effet travaillé à de très nombreuses occasions avec l'Institut depuis sa création il y a une vingtaine d'années, que ce soit dans divers comités, pour la revue Perspective, dans de nombreux jurys. Ces dernières années avait été organisé un séminaire commun, INHA, EHESS, Vases grecs, images, corpus, collection, qui s'est tenu de 2018 à 2022, organisé par François, Alain Schnapp, Nicolina Kay et moi-même. Et je rappellerai enfin que les archives de François Lissarrague ont été données avec beaucoup de générosité par ses enfants Graciane et Peyo en 2022 à la bibliothèque de l'INHA. Elles sont en cours de traitement sous la responsabilité de Guy Maillot et l'abondante documentation que François a rassemblée au cours de sa vie de chercheur pourra bientôt être consultable. Elles rejoignent ainsi le fonds de son ami Robert Guy, entré par son intermédiaire et celle d'Adrienne Lézy-After en 2020. Un grand merci donc à tous nos intervenants, à tous nos invités et à tout le public qui va faire vivre ces 3 journées. Et enfin, merci au service des moyens techniques de l'INHA et à Maxime Grel, qui s'assure que tout se déroule au mieux dans ce bel auditorium. Et merci infiniment au service des manifestations de l'INHA, notamment Mathilde Desbois de la Roche et Eléa van der Stock, qui, comme toujours, ont veillé avec efficacité et bonne humeur à la bonne organisation de ce colloque.
Merci Cécile, je prends la suite, Cécilia d'Ercole. En vous adressant ces quelques mots de bienvenue et de remerciement aux organisatrices de ce colloque, donc Cécile Colonna et Nicolina Kay et le comité scientifique dont vous avez entendu parler. Donc, j'ai le plaisir et l'honneur de représenter 2 lieux de recherche qui ont été au cœur du parcours de François Lissarrague. D'une part, ANIMA, ce laboratoire qui a pris la suite d'un autre milieu de recherche, le Centre Lugernet, où François Lissarrague a apporté une contribution fondamentale et où il a reçu l'impulsion décisive pour ses évolutions. D'autre part, l'École des hautes études en sciences sociales, l'institution à laquelle François Lissarrague appartenait, où il est devenu directeur d'études en 1995. Le président de l'école, Romain Huret, souhaite apporter son mot de bienvenue aux travaux de ce colloque. À Nîmes, le rôle de François Lissarrague a été déterminant dès la création du laboratoire en 2010. Alors directeur du Centre Gernet, François Lissarrague a accompagné la fondation d'Anima, issue de la fusion du Centre Gernet avec 2 autres laboratoires, dirigés à l'époque par 2 personnalités scientifiques qui lui étaient très proches. Le Centre Gustave Glotz, dirigé par Jean-Louis Ferrari, qui avait été camarade de François pendant ses années d'Hippocagne-Cagne au lycée Henri IV. Et l'équipe FIACI, dirigée par Louise Bruy et par Pauline Schmitt, qui était l'une de ses partenaires de longue date, scientifique de longue date au Centre Gernet. C'est dire combien notre laboratoire doit à François Lissarrague. Mais déjà avant la fondation d'Anima, depuis 2004, François avait travaillé avec Jean-Louis Ferrari, Alain Schnapp, Rosinada et d'autres à la réalisation de la bibliothèque de notre centre, la bibliothèque Gernet-Glotz. Pour ce bibliophile convaincu, par vocation et par tradition familiale, Gernet-Glotz a été un lieu de travail privilégié, auquel il revenait avec un plaisir toujours renouvelé après ses séjours dans les bibliothèques étrangères, Oxford, Berkeley et bien d'autres, où il était régulièrement invité grâce à sa renommée internationale. C'est à notre bibliothèque que ses héritiers, Graciane et Peyo Lissarrague, ont destiné une partie significative de sa collection personnelle. Nous leur en sommes très reconnaissants. À l'École des hautes études, sa passion pour l'enseignement a formé de nombreux étudiants, français et étrangers. L'impact de ses recherches novatrices a ouvert des enquêtes communes avec des collègues issus de différents domaines, histoire, anthropologie, art visuel. Certains d'entre eux sont ici pour en parler. Enfin, je voudrais rappeler toutes les institutions de ce quadrilatère Richelieu avec lesquelles François avait noué des relations étroites et qui sont également ici représentées. L'INHA d'abord, que nous remercions pour avoir été à l'initiative de ce colloque. Et ici, pendant des années, François a animé avec Cécile Colonna et Nicolina un séminaire pluridisciplinaire, il était rappelé, sous les images, vases grecs, images, corpus, collection, qui continue aujourd'hui. Avec succès, anthropologie des images, mode d'emploi, Stéphanie Villers est là. Et Cécile continue également. Donc, les collections du Louvre et du cabinet des médailles proches ont grandement nourri sa réflexion. François Lissarrague aimait se définir en spécialiste des images, avec la discrétion qui le caractérisait. Il a été en réalité un pionnier. Un grand inventeur qui a rallié une sensibilité exceptionnelle pour l'objet à une curiosité intellectuelle profonde et jamais assouvie. Ainsi faisant, il a ouvert la voie à des manières totalement nouvelles de regarder les images et la cité grecque. L'ampleur des thématiques qui sont explorées dans ce colloque sont le meilleur témoignage de la créativité et de la richesse qui étaient les siennes et qui viennent enrichir la postérité. Merci et bon colloque.
Merci Cecilia, merci Cécile de ce que vous venez de dire. Nous sommes réunis nombreux et merci à tous ceux qui sont venus, les ouvriers de la première heure, dont quelques exemplaires subsistent encore, et puis tous ceux qui nous ont rejoints au fil du temps, et surtout le nouveau groupe de chercheurs et d'étudiants qui travaillent sur un programme et sur des options dont François avait un peu désigné le parcours. C'est un peu douloureux et difficile pour moi de vous présenter ce colloque. Je vais revenir sur la personnalité de François en espérant ne pas tomber dans le psittacisme parce qu'avec Pauline Schmitt et d'autres ici présents, nous avons déjà tenté de conserver, enfin de présenter, je dirais, à la critique rongeuse des souris, comme disait Marx, ce que nous pensions de l'œuvre de François. François n'aimait guère les commémorations, c'est peu de le dire, et je ne sais s'il aurait apprécié celle-ci, mais je suis persuadé qu'il aurait été heureux de nous voir passer le flambeau à une autre génération de chercheuses et de chercheurs qui ont organisé ce colloque. François a été un professeur stimulant et ses conférences ont rayonné sur presque tous les continents. La ligne de ce colloque, qui a été définie par Cécile et Nicolina et le comité scientifique, consiste à interroger l'ensemble de l'œuvre de François, non dans une volonté, je dirais, d'acquiescement un peu convenu, mais dans le désir d'ouvrir, de continuer et évidemment de se remémorer pour y satisfaire. La ligne, donc, qui est la nôtre, est caractérisée par deux verbes, regarder et interpréter, qui sont tirés du lexique de François. Il a passé sa vie à observer les vases avec passion, du nord au sud, des grandes collections patrimoniales au musée de Site. Le nombre de conservateurs, de chercheurs ici présents, qui ont eu l'occasion de le rencontrer sur son propre terrain, celui des grandes collections muséographiques, sont là pour en témoigner et pour montrer le caractère international de son périple. Jamais François n'a cessé de tenter d'interpréter les vases. Sa recherche est fournie, nourrie, et elle le doit beaucoup, évidemment, au travail de Vidal-Naquet, premier rencontré, de Vernant, avec lequel, et avec François Fontrizy, il a travaillé de très près, et de Marcel d'Étienne, et puis évidemment de ceux qui leur ont succédé. Mais nous aurions peine aujourd'hui à penser, dans ces années 2020, combien, à la fin des années 60 et au début des années 70, tout cela, tout ce que Vernant, Gernet avant lui, avait défini comme une anthropologie du monde antique, était, je dirais, original. Tout cela remettait en cause la doxa de l'Antiquité. Et ils avaient tenté, Vernant et son équipe, une nouvelle approche des mythes et des représentations. En parcourant les grandes sections de notre colloque, vous retrouverez celle de la Cité des images, élaborée dans le contexte de nos séminaires qu'animaient François avec Claude Bérard, Jean-Louis Durand, Françoise Fontrizy et bien d'autres. Je me réjouis que des complices de la première heure, comme Christian Bron, soient présents et nous rappellent le plaisir, le bonheur qu'a été ces rencontres lausannoises et du succès absolument imprévu qui a été celui de cette exposition itinérante dont je crois que les planches moisissent toujours quelque part dans un musée des Canaries parce que des douaniers peu accommodants nous ont refusé qu'on les rapatriât en France. Et c'était des choses qui amusaient François, qui s'était beaucoup battu en espérant récupérer ce trésor. Les thèmes qui seront traités dans notre rencontre, le banquet, la religion, le mariage, les animaux, l'espace et les objets, l'objet et les espaces, de jolis retournements, sont au cœur du lexique de François et de son voyage à travers les collections de vases grecs et des multiples sollicitations de conférences et de colloques dont il faisait l'objet. Je crois peu de chercheurs de notre génération ont été si largement, si diversement invités dans tant d'institutions différentes. François avait un véritable don, celui de la maïeutique, mais il y associait un solide sens de l'humour. Nul doute qu'à l'énoncé du programme de notre rencontre, il aurait souri et ironisé sur le côté un peu inventaire à la Prévert, un auteur qui lui était cher, de notre colloque. Quant au seuil de son curriculum vitae, il inscrivait la formule « François Lissarrague, ancien élève de rien du tout », il démontrait qu'il ne prenait pas les institutions trop au sérieux, mais il appréciait les invitations qui lui venaient de bien des universités et des musées, un peu partout. Il démontrait ainsi une curiosité sans limite pour interpréter les images qu'il mémorisait avec une facilité qui nous a tous déconcertés. Je me souviens de Jean-Louis Durand, esprit extrêmement analytique, et qui disait à François « Mais comment fais-tu ? Tu te rappelles de tout ce que tu as vu ?» François disait « Je ne le fais pas exprès. » L'apparition des appareils photo numériques avait été pour lui une providence. Il enregistrait avec un appétit goulu tout ce qu'il pouvait observer et luttait autant avec les contraintes liées à la prise de vue qu'avec celles des horaires, toujours trop limités, à son goût, des grands musées. Son but n'était pas la découverte de personnalités artistiques. Il ne s'appliquait pas systématiquement, comme Robert Gaille, son ami proche, à proposer et justifier de nouvelles attributions. Mais il ne jetait pas, comme on disait, le bébé avec l'eau du bain et savait faire de la méthode de Beasley un outil de référence et souvent de validation de ses hypothèses. Au cœur de son approche, le monde visuel était toujours là, dans sa définition de la matérialité des vases et dans les innombrables déclinaisons des thèmes. La vieille question, si ancienne qu'elle semblait, je dirais, intouchable, de la division du répertoire entre mythologie et vie quotidienne était pour lui sans intérêt. C'est l'imagier qui était au cœur de sa curiosité et de ses interprétations. Les vases sont porteurs de significations qui, dans leur diversité, éclairent autant l'histoire des arts que l'histoire tout court. Cela nous a donné des échanges qui étaient très stimulants avec Pierre Vidal-Naquet, qui aimait les images, mais qui trouvait qu'elles ne lui apportaient pas ce que l'historien entendait y trouver. Vernant tempérait cela, et François a démontré l'apport des images à l'histoire avec un grand H au fil de ses livres. Les archers, les peltasses, les cavaliers, les banquetaires, les satyres figurent au centre de sa curiosité, ne constituent pas une série d'instantanés de la vie sociale, mais on saisit qu'il s'agit d'un répertoire dûment réfléchi dont François s'est ingénié à révéler la structure. On saisit parfaitement, dans la Cité des Satyres autant que dans les actes du colloque d'Édimbourg, où il laisse éclater son désir de prendre en compte non plus seulement les vases, mais les reliefs, les monnaies et la glyptique, tout cela débouchant sur une analyse comparée à l'intérieur même du champ de l'Altertumswissenschaft. On voit cela dans ses ouvrages, dans l'ouvrage le plus récent, ce colloque collectif d'Édimbourg, mais aussi, bien sûr, tout cela est à l'œuvre et bien lisible et visible dans ses derniers essais. Reste le livre, avec un grand L, comme il l'écrivait, Pantakala. Pantakala, ce livre inachevé, est une sorte d'architecture imagée de l'honneur guerrier et du rôle des métaphores graphiques dans le champ de l'iconographie des vases. Les armes sont une part intrinsèque de l'être des guerriers. Elles l'identifient et exaltent sa puissance au point de se substituer à lui dans une versatile parade des corps et des objets. Après les satyres qui exploraient l'imaginaire des armes, voilà les guerriers et leur panoplie qui affrontent les figures du combat. Le patient travail de Françoise et de Vassaux sur ce manuscrit même, face à l'incomplétude de l'œuvre inachevée, a permis d'en sauver une part et nous permet de pénétrer dans l'intime de la création, dans le laboratoire où François forgeait ses concepts et construisait ses itinéraires d'images. Nous espérons que, convenablement illustrée, cette étude pourra toucher un public. Ce ne sera pas un livre terminé, mais ce sera un livre qui portera témoignage d'une méthode de découverte et révélera peut-être des manières de lire les vases qui ne sont pas toujours évidentes dans d'autres de ses œuvres. Cette réussite extraordinaire qui a fait de lui, disons, l'expert mondial des vases grecs, de l'interprétation des vases grecs, n'est pas limitée au seul monde grec. Sa curiosité de philologue, qui avait le souci du mot juste et du détail révélateur, tout cela le portait à une histoire de l'art dont Ernst Gombrich, qu'il n'a pas connu mais qu'il a lu et relu, et Francis Haskell, dont il a été le traducteur et l'ami proche, à faire de la lecture et des discussions avec ces deux chercheurs qui étaient vraiment des lumières de la discipline, de donner à son interprétation de l'histoire de l'art une dimension nouvelle qui complétait l'approche anthropologique. Dans le fond, François était à la croisée des disciplines. Je gage qu'il aurait été d'accord avec la définition qu'il en donnait lui-même dans le sous-titre du volume d'Édimbourg. Mais, encore une fois, son idée d'une histoire de l'art comparée et comparative, ensemencée par le travail anthropologique, n'était pas limitée au monde grec. En témoigne un travail éditorial très discret, mais qui a pleinement atteint ses objectifs, qu'il a mené avec Jean-Claude Schmitt à travers la collection qu'ils fondèrent chez Gallimard, comme la collaboration de François avec François Pouillon dans un champ qui était à la fois anthropologique est liée à l'histoire de l'art. Au-delà de l'Antiquité, comme l'annonce la dernière section de ce colloque, l'œuvre de François Lissarrague relève autant de l'anthropologie que de l'histoire de l'art, à la croisée des disciplines, comme il l'a énoncé. Je gage qu'il aurait été d'accord avec cette définition, comme je vous l'ai dit il y a un instant. Durant les 3 jours de notre colloque, nous allons emprunter des voies que François avait balisées et qui ouvrent sur de nouvelles réflexions, tant sur les usages des vases que sur leur interprétation et surtout leur réception. Pour cheminer dans cette direction, les 3 maîtres livres de François, Un flot d'images, Archer, Peltas, Cavalier et La Cité des Satyres, sont là pour nous accompagner, tout comme le beau recueil publié par Vassou Zacharie et Élise Lehoux et Noémie Ossoy, qui porte le titre Inspiré, La Cité de regard. La parution toute récente, procurée par Dominique Jaillard et Cléo Carastro, du recueil d'articles de Jean-Louis Durand, Sacrifié en Grèce et ailleurs, ainsi que les mythes grecs, synthèse de Jean-Louis, qui vient aussi de paraître, contribueront certainement à avancer le projet, rendu vivant par la présence de tant d'amis de François et par plusieurs projets en cours de publication de ses travaux, que ce soit Pantacala ou le recueil que Vinciane Pirène-Delforge a préparé. Donc, je pourrais évidemment m'étendre sur tel ou tel point. Vous concevrez que, vu le programme qui nous attend, j'en reste là. Et je vous remercie d'être présent et de réfléchir à ce leitmotiv de l'anthropologie des images, dont François, de façon un peu prémonitoire, disait à la fin d'une de ses présentations, « Le temps avance, les forces faiblissent, mais le plaisir de l'amitié reste le même. » Merci de votre présence.
Alors, pour notre première session, on a le plaisir d'accueillir Oswin Murray sur la session sur le banquet.
Alors, c'est vraiment... Ça marche? Non. Oui. C'est vraiment un grand honneur de parler sur François. François m'a changé la vie. Je me souviens du commencement de mon amitié avec François. C'était en 1984, au premier colloque sur le symposium que j'avais organisé à Balliol College, Oxford. Depuis ce moment, je me sentais accepté dans la fratrie des chercheurs sur ce projet inépuisable qui est le symposium. Et j'ai passé toute une moitié de ma vie avec les 3 mousquetaires géniaux, Kiko Rossi, François Lissarrague et Pauline Schmidt. Je me souviens surtout de sa génialité et son sens de l'humour. Il avait cette légèreté, cette imagination fantaisiste qui illuminait toutes les choses. Pour moi, son livre fondamental, le plus important, est son premier, Un flot d'images, qui révélait pour la première fois la vraie signification de la peinture grecque. Comment lire les vases? Les vases étaient surtout associés à un jeu d'esprit. qui ne prend pas au sérieux le monde de la cité. C'est le même esprit qui s'est aussi révélé dans son dernier livre de sa vie, La Cité des Satyres. Il était lui-même vraiment, selon moi, un satyre. Et comme il disait, les Grecs ne boivent pas en Suisse. Une fois, à Paris, il présidait à un colloque que nous avions organisé sur les plaisirs intellectuels. Il présidait, je parlais des idées d'Immanuel Kant sur l'amitié intellectuelle. Et le propos de Kant, que ce n'était pas possible pour un philosophe d'être ami avec un autre philosophe, parce que l'amitié dépendait de l'opposition de la mode de vie. Philosophe et général, et je me souviens surtout que François était le fils d'un général, peuvent être amis, mais pas deux philosophes. Kant devait être un homme sans amis, je disais. À ce moment, François tirait de sa poche un minuscule livre qu'il avait acheté juste avant. La vie sexuelle d'Immanuel Kant. Le salon se tirait aux éclats, au moment chouette, comme il dirait. Et c'est pour moi le souvenir le plus génial de François. Cet amour de plaisanterie. J'espère que dans ce colloque, nous ne serons pas trop sérieux. François était un satyre. Et alors, avec ces mots, je veux appeler un ami, peut-être l'ami le plus important de François, Daphne Williams, qui va parler sur un bouquet des images.
Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for my terrible English. My French is worse. I'd like to thank the organisers and the supporters of this conference very much for these coming days. I'd also like to thank François. It's a great honour to present some thoughts on such a subject in memory of a dear friend, François, with Oswin as our symposiarchos. 20 years ago, in 2003, Oswin concisely set out François' contribution to the study of the symposium and to iconography as a whole, and concluded that, I quote, Lissarrague thus transformed the study of iconography by introducing humour, sophistication, and self-reference into the study. It's François' remarkable scholarship and gentle friendship, and his satyr-like element, that we celebrate today. And it seemed fitting to start with his first book, as we've said, his pioneering Flot des Images. The symposium was to be a theme that maintained his interest throughout his life, with his lyrical contribution to Louise Détre's catalogue for the exhibition Terre, appearing as late as 2020. We open our banquet of Athenian images with a fragment of an extraordinary cup dedicated on the Acropolis, a piece that since its excavation has both lost and gained fragments. So we show François's reconstruction drawing from his 1991 paper on the bottom right. I remember talking to him about this piece back in the 1980s. The white ground interior showed the standing figure of Athena pouring a libation with a gilded fiale. There are also the remains of Euphronios' signature as potter. The exterior is in normal red figure, but with only a single figure on each side. A very unusual scheme that seems to be associated especially with white ground cups for cultic contexts. On one side, we have the hand of a figure to the right holding out a cantharos and a long inscription curving down in front of his lost head. It once read, "Spendo toi daimoni toi agathoi." The other fragment has the torso and head of a bearded man cradling a spear in his left hand and holding out a fiale in his right. From his mouth, written retrograde is Zu Soter. The angle of the spear, the height of the torso of the bearded figure on the wall of the cup, and the lack of a cushion at the man's left elbow all indicate that he was not reclining but seated. And the same was surely true for the figure on the other side. These two seated figures are shown performing what our literary sources record were key ritual acts connected with the symposium. The sponde to the agathos daimon is regularly associated with the transition from the deipnon to the symposion and considered to be of neat wine. From the actions of our figure, we may understand that after the pouring of the libation, suggested by the downward flow of his words, the cantharos was passed to a neighbour, as indicated by its horizontal position, and perhaps even the little finger steadying it. In this way, perhaps, everyone was warned of the power of Dionysus, while Agathos Daimon was welcomed as the gentler spirit of mixed wine. The bearded figure, calling on Zeus Soter, has his fiale tilted downwards and was actually pouring a libation. This dedication accompanied the start of the third crater, proverbially the last crater of a respectable symposium. Whether the fiale was then circulated remains unclear, although the number of times symposiasts are shown holding this special sort of vessel might suggest that it was. Who then are the figures making these libations? And why are they seated? The figure making a libation to the Agathos Daimon holds a cantharos, a vase regularly assigned to both Dionysus and Heracles. It would seem highly unlikely for Dionysus himself to make a libation to Agathos Daimon, whoever Agathos Daimon was. So we should perhaps do better to identify him as Heracles. Indeed, the cantharos is of a special type, particularly associated with Heracles. And you see here a bronze example of the type from Mount Oita, and Heracles holding one on a contemporary vase. The bearded figure with a spear could perhaps be interpreted as the god Ares, but again it seems somewhat improbable that he would make a libation to Zeus Soter. And we might better turn perhaps to a companion of Heracles, such as his half-brother Iphicles or his nephew Iolaus. Yet neither of these figures had much of a profile at Athens. And then the answer comes that it's Theseus, here shown not as the young hero, but deliberately as a mature man, king of Athens, the founder of the Panathenaic Games, as well as Plutarch's Allos Houtos Irakles. Indeed, we should note the date of the cup, 490 to 480, and remember that Plutarch also said it was only after Theseus's miraculous appearance at the Battle of Marathon that he was honoured by the Athenians as a hero. Heracles, of course, was also supposed to have appeared at that battle. The two heroes might then be thought of as being invited to appear on the Acropolis, along with Athena, to perform the key libations at a banquet to celebrate Marathon. The fact that the two heroes are shown seated inevitably suggests a memory of the ancient use of stools rather than couches. Something perhaps for 5th century Athenian vase painters was preserved for them through Homeric descriptions of banquets. The idea of heroes or deities sitting to drink was not, however, a fixed iconographic scheme, but it may well have had a particular significance on this carefully constructed cultic cup. From this sort of heroic start, we'd like to turn to more mortal ones. Around the beginning of the 5th century, representations of symposia not only became more specific in the allusions carried by subsidiary objects, but began to be more interested in their space and setting. As a result of an interest by the vase painters in the foreshortening of the human figure, we also find symposiasts and their couches foreshortened, end on in back view, an idea that alluded to the rectangular space of the symposium. We should also note that some show that the couches were set on a low plinth or on blocks, suggesting or prefiguring the raised surrounds of the late classical androns that facilitated the cleaning of the space and the preservation of the legs of the costly furniture. On a column crater by the Nausicaa painter of the middle of the 5th century, we find something else, an ingeniously angled spatial regression. The symposiost on the right is in the foremost plane, on the right. His back is to us, his table on the far side of his couch. The flute girl is in the central open space of the andron. On the other side of that space is the symposiast on the left, his table and footstool before his couch. The vase painter has thus attempted to give us a regressive view from right to left that crosses from one side of the andron to the other, a sort of view through the doorway almost. And we shall see this spatial illusion again in a moment. On several 5th century vases, a single fluted column is included. It's normally set at one side of the scene, as on this famous cup by the Brygos painter. But on a crater in Montauban, the column is central. This is the only example I found. But what do these columns represent? Does a single column simply suggest a built environment? Or does it indicate that in the 5th century, beyond the andron was a courtyard with a portico? Or could symposia have sometimes actually been held in a courtyard, either because the house had no designated andron, or the guest list had become too long? In support of an occasional courtyard setting, we should note the 4th century vase on the bottom right that shows a bound-up awning above the symposiast, a cheap alternative to a colonnade, perhaps. And it was not needed, of course, at night. To the first quarter of the 5th century belongs a remarkable enocui with male symposiasts, drinking and making their own music, on both the shoulder and the body. The frieze on the body is set behind a facade of some 3 fluted Ionic columns. The couches and tables are not shown. This remarkable arrangement, together with the repeated sequence on the shoulder, is surely significant. Could it be that the vase painter was trying to suggest a view into a civic structure rather than a domestic one? Perhaps the prytaneon or a stoa within which symposia could be held. On some Athenian vases dating to the first half of the 4th century, we find 3 or more columns in the background. That in St. Petersburg, you see it here, is the most elaborate. It not only gives a parallel for the Nausicaa's angled spatial view, although now employing the height of the field in polygnoton fashion, but it also adds 2 intriguing figures. On the right, a standing man holds a fiale and holds it out, and a jug in his other hand. Nearby is a bell crater set on the ground, watched over by a youth. Neither figure has been provided with a cline. It would seem very likely, therefore, that both have some sort of official role. The man is surely to be thought of as about to make a libation dedicating a new crater, a symposiakos. The youth standing over the crater might then be an official who watched over the quantities drunk at public gatherings, an oinoptes. Such a non-private context might also explain the himation unexpectedly worn by the serving boy on the far left, who has dropped his jug and tries to calm a symposiast overexcited by the music. Might this then be a public gathering? Could it be in a sanctuary indicated by the multiple columns? I'm leaving you lots of questions. It's supposed to be good for you. Let's now mention some of the activities and actions of the symposiasts themselves. There was, of course, drinking, music, and sex, but also kotobos playing, and a greedy hetaira here with her skiphos is trying to play the game. And very occasionally, more intellectual tests, such as the holding in turn of a myrtle branch, the isakos, while singing a scholion pros myrinein. We also see the particularly messy personal consequences of it all. Open vomiting and allusions to urination, here by means of juxtaposing a giant cup and a large two-handled jug, unexpectedly held by the symposiast and not by a serving boy. A graffito on an agora fragment of this type of vessel names it an amis, a pot de chambre. No wonder pebble mosaic floors were invented, and who could doubt the need for perfume and incense? We may also sometimes observe the passing of kilikis, as on a cup by the foundry painter, probably indicating a toast, epirexia. Indeed, when a symposiast holds out horizontally a cup by its handle, he should be thought of as passing it on. By and large, when he holds it by the foot, it is full of wine, or he wants it filled, and that is how he holds it when he drinks. He uses his right hand unless he wishes to employ that in some other action. Some scholars, including Oswin, have recently drawn attention to the famous Tomb of the Diver at Paestum and read the action of one symposiast holding out in his right hand a cup by its foot as a greeting to a late, finely dressed arrival, accompanied by a younger companion and a flute girl. To support this idea, Oswin pointed to the dipinti on some 6th century Little Master cups, most commonly bearing the words "chaire kai pie you," and the same to the person on the other end of the telephone. Although we show here the more explicit message, "chaire kai pie teindi." Nevertheless, although there might have seemed to be a deliberate exchange across the corner of the tomb, the raised left hand of the late arrival's companion can hardly have been intended to take the cup, while, as we've seen, gripping by the foot usually implies use by the holder rather than handing over. Indeed, I wonder if the raising of the cup is not really to be connected with a summons to the serving boy on the other wall, jug in hand, already beginning to leave the grand crater. With these late arrivals on the Paestum fresco in mind, we should like to mention 3 vases. The first is a poorly known bell crater in Syracuse, spotted by Natasha recently, a fine piece that I may think be assigned to the Polygnoton group and date around 440 BC. It's of particular interest not just because the symposiast, seen from behind over on the right, but because of what is happening on the left. Here, a man with a short beard approaches, an unusual beard, in fact, accompanied by a young boy aulos player. His arm is round the boy's shoulders, and his cloak nonchalantly disposed over the end of his stick. He's naked. The youth on the nearest couch raises his empty right hand. His bearded companion is engaged in conversation with the youth in the corner. The first youth and his bearded companion are perhaps to be understood as reclining on the first couch inside the door on the left. This position would have controlled the entry of late arrivals, as well as the movement of servants and entertainers, and was surely the host's position, the eschaté cliné, the lowest couch in precedence. The first, the protikliní, being on the other side of the doorway, whence all sympathetic activities circulated, anti-clockwise, epidexia. This scene prompts one to consider for a moment the difficulty in understanding the meanings of particular gestures as opposed to some actions. We might see the youth's raised empty hand as a gesture of surprise or of greeting for the late arrival. But it might also be a reaction to the auloi, for we know the same gesture well from vases like the Euphronios crater, we see there, and from a polygnoton dinos in Ferrara up on the top right. Furthermore, setting all these images together makes one question the scene with a column seemingly in the center of the symposium scene. Could the bearded aulites there really be another late arrival, coming in from the courtyard, blowing, as it were, his own trumpet? Our second vase, with a similarly late arrival, is a fine column crater in Dublin of the first decade of the 4th century. And here we find a trio approaching the symposium, a clearly drunken, full-bearded man with a long torch, escorted by a pair of youths, one helping to support him, the other following behind. The symposiast ignores this entry. Perhaps he really is uninvited, an akletos. Finally, the scene on the neck of a grand volute crater in from Spina of about 450, 440, reveals an interloper who seems to beg at the knees of the central symposiast, rather like a Priam before Achilles, a large bowl of fruit replacing the body of Hector. Is he an akletos seeking a place? Note also the door to the andron on the far left, and beyond 2 couches, a third seen end on at the far right of the scene. The other side of the vase shows the remaining 4 couches of a 7 cliné andron. The next scenes were thus conceived as being continuous, just like the wraparound Amazonomachy on the body. These vase images of the Pistum fresco and the Pistum fresco naturally make us think of Plato's symposium and the noisy arrival of Alcibiades at Agathon's party, the loud knocking, the rumpus of revellers with a flute girl out in the courtyard, Alcibiades, excessively drunk, roaring out, "Where is Agathon?" before being propped against the doorpost by his companions to address the host. These vases are clearly neither photographic images of real symposia, nor pages from a bande dessinée of Plato's symposium, but they indicate well the way that his dialogue introduced some of the sympathetic habits of the Athenian elite, filtered through his own philosophical lens. In addition to the guests, the symposium space included, as we've seen, naked serving boys and dressed girls, equipped with cups, jugs, ladles, and sieves. In general, the symposiasts do not interact with them in any physical manner, although there are some exceptions, and one should remember the story of Sophocles. In a famous pair of images, we see servants refilling a dinos. Incidentally, their garments suggest that they did not enter the andron. Only the naked boys on the left of the Euphronios crater will have done that. They use pointed amphoras indicators of wealth and allusions to both quantity and to importation. On these vases, it is clear that the mixing vessel was placed in an adjacent, similarly lamp-lit space, rather than cluttering up the restricted area amid the couches, where the servers were busy and the musical entertainers performed. As a necessary piece of sympathetic equipment, such mixing vessels might be shown near the couches, but that does not mean they were ever physically central, nor indeed were they ever static, for we see them on the move in the Komos, both calyx craters and column craters, and I don't really understand why, but there they are. If the mixing vessel is common, and the pointed amphora with neat wine also shown, what of the hydria, with water to dilute the wine god's power? We know of only one late example of water being poured from a hydria into a crater on the left. And the context is Poseidon's watery realm and the arrival of the young Theseus. Nevertheless, we might note on an oinokoi in Copenhagen on the right, a servant carrying a hydria on his shoulder. A psychter by his side, he's no doubt heading for the symposium. Another apparent absentee from our symposia was the table amphora. Although we see a youth holding a small table amphora by means of a cord, together with a tripod kista on the left there, a fancy sort of food basket. Perhaps table amphoras were kept for special vintages and even put on display outside the andron on a kilikeon, as depicted in contemporary Etruscan wall paintings and on a Hellenistic terracotta from Myrina. Let's focus now for a moment on two smaller pieces of sympotic equipment. First, the ladle or kaiathos, a vessel that clearly had a long history, but which you only see on vases from the last quarter of the 6th century onwards. We know examples in silver and bronze. It functioned in two ways. It enabled the removal of a small measure of liquid from narrow-mouthed vessels, and by reasons of its long handle, and it also avoided any flour or anthos on the top of the surface of the wine, much like the Spanish venencia used for drawing wine from sherry barrels and aerating it. Rather dramatic pose. An accompanying strainer ensured further purity. Examination of the volume of such ladles indicates that they were made to hold the official measure known as a kaiathos. It's this, the kaiathos measure, delivered in some multiple to each symposiast, that in fact controlled the consumption of wine, rather than the size of the crater or the cup, both of which we know vary greatly in volume. We've mentioned and seen the psychter, a vessel in which wine, probably neat, was cooled. If there was a fashion for chilled wine in Athens, we might wonder about the possibility of mulled wine, that is, vin chaud. The appearance in the early decades of the 5th century of small round-bottomed jugs, known as kytra, in the hands of serving boys, and even hung up in the background, seems to provide an answer. The shape is known in cooking-ware fabric in various sizes and was clearly intended for heating a liquid. They often have blackened undersides. There are also smaller bronze versions and even black glazed ones, as you see. The frequent combination with the strainer suggests that heating was carried out together with the addition of various flavorings. The Romans drank such warming winter drinks, so why didn't the Greeks? We should like to end, though, with two intriguing scenes that take us beyond the Athenian symposia into other symposia. First, a special coral red cup signed by Hegesiboulos as potter. The center of one side is dominated by a man on a lone couch and surrounded by naked servants. To either side is a woman seated on a klismos with swan head terminals, a rather Eastern fashion. They are clearly neither slaves nor hetairai, but family. The other side of the cup has a komos. All sport turban-like headdresses, as do the two women on the other side. This headgear, known from Alcman, Sappho, and Pindar, was called a mitra and was considered Lydian. The interior of the cup has the figure of an old man with his dog. His profile, as has often been remarked, makes him look Near Eastern rather than Athenian. There would thus seem to be clear Eastern references in all three scenes. The sort of solitary event, a monoposion, to use François' word, is known in the East from mid-7th century in Assyria and by mid-6th century in East Greece. Furthermore, it should be noted that the name of the potter, Hegesiboulos, is otherwise only known to us from Thasos, where his son was significantly named Lidos, and of course from Clazomenae, where Hegesiboulos, Anaxagoras' father, lived. As a result, we may consider that the scenes on this cup reflect Ionian practices known to the vase painter rather than Athenian ones. Was this based on family memory, or were actual non-Athenian symposia held in Athens? Another question to ponder. Finally, just for the sake of some fragments, we turn to a tantalizing group from an elaborate zone cup, dated circa 470, and divided between Oxford and Bryn Mawr. On one side of the exterior, we find parts of a Greek arming scene. On the other, a fight involving Persians, including a square, upturned Persian standard. In the zone around the tondo, there are parts of 4 or 5 reclining symposiasts, all wearing what has been referred to as full Persian rider dress, Anaxarides, Candice, and Kidaris. One holds out 2 fialae, stacked, one inside the other. Another, an animal-headed rhiton, and a third has what seems to be a bread bun or a cake. Stacks of such metal fialae were a typical means for the Athenian vase painter to depict Eastern wealth. The rhiton is donkey-headed and has a foot. It represents thus an adaptation by Athenian potters rather than a true Persian example. This is then an Athenian vase painter's visualization of some sort of a Persian banquet. But why and where? With the scenes of fighting Persians on the exterior, we might perhaps remember that following the final defeat of the Persians at Plataea and the capture of Mardonius's grand tent with its huge amounts of booty, including, no doubt, many Persian metal vessels, the Spartan leader of the combined Greek forces, Pausanias, remarkably ordered that in celebration a Persian banquet be reenacted, essentially a fake foreign symposium. To conclude, although we've avoided some aspects of the banquet, notably the deipnon and the déjeuner sur l'herbe, we have tried to show that examination of small details, bearing in mind both reality and illusion, can deepen our understanding of the various contexts of and actions within the Athenian symposia. One of the special things about François as a scholar was his willingness to look carefully at interactions and manipulations within images, and to see them all effortlessly and engagingly in his extraordinarily wide knowledge of ancient cultures. We wanted to celebrate this and encourage its continuation in his memory, for so much remains still to be understood about the Greek symposium. Thank you very much from both sides.
Thank you very much for that very illuminating talk about what can be found in detail about the symposium from representations on vases. I wonder whether we should carry straight on and have questions at the end. Is that a sensible thing? It might tire our audience to hear less English, to tire our audience less, to have English concentrated. So, well, stay here because we're going to have questions afterwards.
Okay. I'm just moving on.
So now I call upon Jasper Gaunt to talk about the aesthetics of the Greek banquet in bronze and precious metals.
Thank you. Where is the...
Don't ask me. Is there an expert in the house?
Sorry.
Is there a doctor in the house?
Sorry, I don't know where the next one is. Thank you for the tech help, which is essential, I find. It's a great privilege to participate in these proceedings, and I record with great gratitude the invitation of Cécile Colonna and all the hard, conscientious work that she and her colleagues, Nicolina Kay, Elea van der Stok, and others have put in to make this colloquium happen. Even a small symposium of this kind, it takes an enormous amount of work, and I'm very, very grateful to all of them. I'm also especially grateful to His Highness Sheikh Hamad bin Abdullah Al Thani for permission to present 3 vessels in the Al Thani collection, and to several colleagues, Dr. Amin Jaffa, Director of the Al Thani collection, Brendan Hatch, Angelique Othari, and Laura Stewart for other forms of assistance. In his beautifully written, extraordinarily perceptive work on the symposium, François Lissarrague took as his primary point of departure the world of decorated pottery, including familiar masterpieces like the François vase, the Attic black-figured volucrator signed twice by Clytius's painter and Agathimos's potter in Florence on the left. He was, however, also conscious of a related but very different realm, that of sympathetic wares in metal, bronze, silver, and gold, like the, to my mind, exactly contemporary crater of the same shape from Vix near Châtillon-sur-Seine in Burgundy on the right. Thus, and I quote, François wrote in the Aesthetics of the Greek Banquet, the crater becomes a privileged, honored object, a unique symbol for everything the symposium means to Greek culture. It is a luxury item, often crafted of precious metal, bronze, silver, or gold, and thus belongs among the agalmata, the offerings particularly dear to the gods. The profound conceptual aesthetic differences between the black-figured crater, exuberantly decorated on every available surface, and the austere, minimalist treatment of the supremely patrician bronze version are clear even at first glance. In recent generations, less attention has been accorded to the decoration of metal vessels than their counterparts in figural pottery. By way of introducing this significant category of material, this paper addresses 2 classes of archaic and classical sympathetic vessels in metal, those with kouros handles and those with animal fights involving lions and bulls or deer, and their decoration and its significance. It begins by addressing the appearance and circulation of these vessels in general, before suggesting that the syntax of their decoration is constructed by the wealthy, land-based ruling elite from a self-consciously restricted vocabulary, which at times develops into its own little narrative. Not unnaturally, this vocabulary is extremely conservative, and much of its formulation can already be sensed clearly in the imagery of the Homeric similes. Three major finds give a very good idea of the appearance and circulation of archaic and classical Greek bronze vessels. The graves at Trebiniste above Lake Ohrid in the Republic of North Macedonia included 2 volucrators, of which one, on the left, now in Belgrade, was recently restored in Italy. The so-called Heroon deposit at Pistum in Magna Graecia included several hydriae, one of which is at the center on the screen. And the find in a wooden boat at Pishani in Ukraine contained a selection of bronze vessels, including the pointed amphora on the right. These are now in Kiev, or they were. The vessels from these 3 finds number over 100 and were created over a period of 4 or 5 generations from the second quarter of the 6th century until the end of the turn of the 5th, 4th. They are remarkably uniform in appearance and manufacture. The bodies are hammered and, except for occasional pattern work like shoulder tongues, were otherwise left entirely plain. It is in the cast elements, exceptionally appliques on the necks and tripod bases of volucrators, but as a matter of general standard practice, the handles that the location of the locus for decoration arises. At Trebiniste, Bogdan Filo, later Prime Minister of Bulgaria and executed by the Russians in 1945, and Karl Skorpil found a group of graves with very rich burial goods. Some are currently the subject of an exhibition at Sofia. Much armor, including helmets decorated with strips of gold foil and gold face masks, one of each on the screen, confirmed that the deceased were warrior chieftains. They evidently had a taste for imported metalwork for their drinking parties, for the exquisite strips of repoussé gold bearing lotus blossoms, tongues, and feather pattern on a silver beaker and horn confirmed that they, like the bronze vessels, were made in Greece. Now, the excavation in 1954 by Pellegrino Sestieri of a chamber sunk below the surface between the Roman Forum and the Temple of Athena at Paestum on the left revealed an array of bronze vessels seen as a group on the right. Whatever purpose this structure served, it was clearly created with profound veneration in mind. It's a highly serious setting. The deposit also contained, on the left two images, an Attic black-figured amphora of type B attributed to the Priam painter, potted around 510 BC, and useful, therefore, for the dating of the find. It gives the apotheosis of Heracles on one side and Dionysus and Hermes with Maenads and Satyrs on the other. The most famous of the bronze vessels is the charming Hydria, with a lion standing on its hind legs and peering into the container on the right. The context of the vessels in the wooden boat discovered in the depths of Ukraine must be left to the imagination to infer. They are certainly not the products of a single workshop, and it would seem that they're not even contemporary with one another. It would seem inconceivable, however, that such a cargo of vessels created so far away in distant Greece and brought together for shipment could be destined for anyone other than an elite patron, whether directly by trade or indirectly as spoils of war. Now, the austere decoration of Greek bronze vessels privileges the profile of shape of which archaic Greek artisans, whether metalsmiths or potters, were such masters. Beyond the confines of the Greek world, this vision was not shared. Both to the east and to the west, vessels with sophisticated repoussé elaboration were widely made. The somewhat earlier finds at Malik in northern Iran in 1947 brought to light a long and plentiful tradition of metalwork with figural decoration in relief. For an example, an electrum beaker in the Louvre on the left with bullmen taming buffaloes, and a gold cup in the Altani collection on the right with a procession of stags. These beakers in precious metal are small, but the great Near Eastern cauldrons of Assyrian and related backgrounds, like the one from Palestrina in the Villa Giulia on the left, show that vessels were made at a much larger scale with highly elaborated bodies. Further west, and contemporary with archaic Greece, are the so-called Celtic situlae, like the one from Bologna on the right, with its marvelous processions of warriors, the scenes of feasting and sacrifice, ploughing and hunting, and mythical animals. A corollary of the primacy of form is that the material or medium from which the vessel is made is largely a function of economy. Gold is more expensive than silver, and silver much more than bronze. The gold bowl dedicated by the Kypselids at Olympia in Boston on the left is essentially the same shape as a contemporary bronze one dedicated in Cyprus and now in the British Museum on the right. 300 years later, this same truth holds. A silver calyx cup in the Altani collection, on the left, is essentially a more expensive version than a bronze one would have been, but we can infer the presence of gold ones from Attic black glazed examples like two in Atlanta that were taken to Macedonia, as Duffrey Williams has seen, for gilding before burial. Now, the archaeological contexts at Trebiniste, Paestum, and Pishani are suggestive of the circulation of bronze vessels in elite circles. An artistic commission from one of these elite members, perhaps only a generation earlier, provides an illuminating introduction to the vocabulary of the decoration of archaic bronze vessels in Greece. Sometime in the last quarter of the 7th century, a sculptor from Naxos erected a statue on Delos. Only the feet and base are preserved on the left. The statue itself had broken at the ankles, but the outline of the 2 feet, left in front of right, is enough for us to recognize that it took the form of a striding nude male figure, a kouros. Geoffrey Hurwitz raised the possibility that the figure might have been carrying a votive animal across his shoulders, like a calf or a ram, but while this cannot be excluded, it seems unlikely at this early date. Yorgos Bakalakis suggested that the thighs of a kouros from Naxos might belong in the center and went on to restore the whole in plaster, and that's reconstructions on the right. Despite doubts voiced by Marguerite Jacob Felsch and Pierre Levesque, this association has been upheld more recently by Georgia Kalkourou Alevras. This particular discussion need not detain us. The base itself is, broadly speaking, triangular in shape, each corner decorated with its own relief sculpture. At the front, on the axis of the statue's advance, is a ram's head. Behind, projecting outwards from the right angle, is a lion's head. On the left, sinister side, is a gorgoneon. An inscription carved on the proper right, and written boustrophedon, reads Euthykatides manetheke ho Naxios poiesas. Euthykatides the Naxian set me up as a dedication, having made me. The syntax of Euthykatides' dedication presents him as a youthful man in his prime, enhanced by images in relief of a ram, a lion's head, and a gorgonion. It might be thought that these subjects were a function of no more than personal choice. However, precisely the same combination of symbols recurs only just a little later in the context of decorated bronze sympathetic tableware. The decorative repertoire of archaic Greek bronze vessels is, of course, as varied as it is delightful, but so many of them seem to survive as one-offs, or at least not made as a major series in their own right. But there is, however, a major consistent class, one studied by Dorothy Kent Hill in 1958, and again by Conrad Stibbe in 2000 and 2006. And these include some of the very finest pieces of metalwork preserved from archaic Greece. And this, of course, is the class of vessels with kouros handles. A hydria from Novi Pazar, now in Belgrade on the left, has its vertical handle in the form of a kouros, who stands on two recumbent rams that project laterally. Beneath his feet is a gorgonion. As he arches backwards, he rests against two lions that recline around the rim, his hands taking hold of their tails. A smaller handle in Baltimore, this time from an innocuous, on the right, is cast with the same deployment of the same elements. Until fairly recently, this composition was thought to be confined to the vertical handles of hydriae and innocuae, but it also occurs on a superb neck amphora in a private collection. And for some of the loose handles, there has been disagreement about whether they come from hydriae or innocuae. They don't seem to be one or the other. And these discussions should probably be revisited in the light of whether they might instead come from neck amphorae. There are, in fact, quite a few examples of this, precisely this kind of vertical handle. Two more, an innocuous from Ugento, once in Taranto, is on the left, and a hydria fragment presumably dedicated on the Athenian Acropolis, and was recovered in the excavations of the Athenian Agora from the north slope, is on the right. Most of these were made over the course of 3 or 4 generations, from the middle of the 6th century until the early 5th. The question of the places where they may have been made seems to me intractable. I'm thinking of the visceral disagreements between the two supremely distinguished scholars of Greek bronzes of recent times, Claude Rollet and Conrad Stibbe, whose back and forth has been described as the conversation of the deaf, le dialogue des sourds. On the other hand, the recorded find spots are quite telling. These document the places where their owners appreciated them, where they were understood. The distribution is in fact quite extensive. The North Balkans, Serbia and the Republic of North Macedonia, Athens, the Peloponnese, Magna Graecia, and central Italy. Even more fascinating, perhaps, are imitations of this class made in the Greek periphery. An innocuous handle in New York, on the left, from Luigi Palma di Cesnola's excavations on Cyprus, possibly at Kourion or Dali, was made as Hartmut Matthias has seen, on Cyprus. Here the youth rests his hands on the lion's haunches rather than holding their tails. The circular gorgonion beneath his feet can be made out, as can vestiges of 2 diminutive rams. An amphora in the British Museum in the center was made by an emigrant Greek craftsman in Vulci in Etruria, who combined the idea of kouros-handled vessels with the then recently invented class of siren calpides. There's a siren under his feet. The handle in the Metropolitan Museum on the right was made a good deal later by a purely Etruscan bronzesmith. Its chief virtue is to record the lingering importance of the type that it emulates with such conspicuous lack of success. This well-attested class of late archaic handles raises the question whether their elements might be read programmatically. At a simple level, it would seem that, like the grave markers for the dead, but smaller and made for the world of the living, the kouros on the handle is a radiant Apollonian expression of the idealized self-representation of aristocratic male family members. The power and prosperity of the aristocrats who ruled Greece, John Kenyon Davis's propertied families, whether Athenian or not, the Kalloi Kagathoi, largely stemmed from their landed estates and flocks of sheep. On the handles, the kouroi literally stand on these flocks. Greek society was one in which the expression shepherd of the people was familiar, not just the commander-in-chief of the Greek army at Troy. This is how Agamemnon is famously characterized repeatedly in the Iliad, the poimen laon. In the same epic, Priam likens Odysseus walking through the Greek army to a ram walking among sheep, and Trojans follow Aeneas as a sheep follows the ram. For Hesiod, those who were rich in flocks were the wealthy, and this imagery continues to be current in archaic times. Anacreon speaks of Artemis as shepherding her people. In the Eumenides, Aeschylus has Apollo criticize the Furies as a flock without a shepherd of flocks. And a fragment of Euripides' tragedy Temenos exhorts that a commander, if he is just, will lead as a shepherd. Martin West felt that this phrase, quote, does not seem to be the expression of an abiding Greek conception. He was certainly right to stress the much greater and more ancient prevalence of this image in Sumerian, Akkadian, and Hittite texts, as also in later Assyrian chronicles. And doubtless this is where the Greek examples were appropriated from. But it would seem impossible to separate these kouros-handled vessels from the motif. After all, they were made for the shepherds of the people. It is furthermore notable that the ram's fleeces are often very richly textured, as if consciously to convey the weight of the wool they bear. Upon this pastoral basis, the kouroi on the handles are enabled to reach up towards the greatest, even royal symbol of power, the lion. The gesture of holding these kings of the beasts by their tails presents them as being totally domesticated, entirely enthralled to their sovereign dominion. Like representations of the mistress of the wild animals, the Potnia Theron, the image is derived from the ancient Near East, where it goes back at least to the 5th millennium. For example, a stamp seal from Til Barsip in Syria in the British Museum on the left. They are especially popular on Persian seals, like the early 5th century blue Chalcedony pyramidal stamp seal in the Staatliche Münzsammlung in Munich in the center, which shows a king swinging 2 lions upside down by their tails. And impressions of 2 cylinder seals with the same composition from Persepolis are also on the screen. The Greek images would seem to be a little less self-confident, a little bit more ginger than their proud Near Eastern counterparts. A related motif on Neo-Elamite sympathetic ware of the 7th and 6th centuries BC depicts a tame lion curled up obediently on the omphalos of Phialae. One in the Altani collection is on the screen. So when the Phialae was in use, this lion would be over the finger of, if not under the thumb, of the king who used it. 2 further Phialae of the same class bear royal inscriptions. One offered for online auctions by Timeline in October 2017 bears the name of Unsak, king of Samati, son of Zigutiyash. I owe my knowledge of this to Dr. Jack Ogden. The other, published 30 years ago, is inscribed for an earlier king. The inscriptions prove that the type was current for at least 2 generations. The clientele that used the Greek bronze vessels had every reason to be familiar with images of this kind, from business transactions or imported textiles. And besides the entire alphabet, Tom Brown pointed out that it is in the 7th and 6th centuries that so many fundamentally important Greek words are appropriated from the Levant, among them the standard unit of weight, the mina, a word for a wine jar, kados, and commodities like incense and myrrh, which first appear in Sappho. Finally, the gorgoneion below the kouros's feet on the bronze handles. On Euthykatides' statue base, it looked out for the left, the shadowy side, the side of ill luck. On the vessels, the gorgoneion must be apotropaic, an insurance policy for continued sustainable prosperity. There are variations on this combination of motifs. On the largest group, a palmet is substituted for the gorgoneion below. Examples of this include among Hydrii, one from Randazzo in Berlin on the left, and one from Paestum on the right. Among Inokoi, the silver one from Ushak on the left, and handles mostly from Italy in the Louvre, Copenhagen, the British Museum, and Ulster in Northern Ireland. Another variation eliminates the kouros, but preserves the gorgoneion and rams below and the lions on the rim. Examples of this, clearly in this case from one workshop, include handles in Boston and Berlin and a hydria in the Louvre. It is a measure of the potency and persistence of this combination of motifs that a century later, the chryselephantine doors of the Parthenon were decorated with bosses or roundels featuring the heads of lions, rams, and gorgonaia. Identical symbols can be found singly on many types of artifact in archaic Greece. Geoffrey Spear pointed out nearly 30 years ago that the great degree of overlap between what he called emblems on early coins and gems. Greek coins developed, as the British Museum's label on early coins puts it, around 600 BC from the ancient use of precious metals as a means of valuation and exchange, and from the use of personal seals and signatures to mark the origin of documents. The recumbent lions, rams familiar from the wrestle handles recur for examples on coins of Cyzicus on the left, and a Chalcedony scarab in Istanbul on the right, which is inscribed with the first letter of its owner's name. But they spread much more, these images spread much more pervasively than this. They were popular for plastic containers for perfume, like the Proto-Corinthian example in the Getty on the left. There are also Rhodian versions of this, as shield devices, as one in Karlsruhe on the right, and as representations of these shield devices, as on a cup attributed to the Amasis painter in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the center. A second class of archaic handles are elaborated with animal fights that feature lions attacking another creature, a bull or a deer. Some of these were attached to basins and may perhaps not therefore always have been used in sympotic contexts, but they are vessels nonetheless, and their owners were presumably the same. A handle from Vouni on Cyprus on the left is the work of a late archaic Greek craftsman. The one on the right in the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore would seem to be substantially later, for the fur of the feline on the left, this time a tiger, is scored for inlay stripes, presumably in copper and silver. Although the museum dates it to the 4th century, I think this must be in fact Hellenistic or early imperial. Between these lies a series of related images on Etruscan sympotic furniture on tripods made in Vulci by the same Greek emigrant craftsman who cast the kouros-handled amphora in the British Museum already mentioned. These are at the top of the arched top of the legs. The one on the left is in the Metropolitan Museum. Fascinatingly, but not surprisingly, this motif can also be traced to the ancient Near East. For a loose omphalos from a Neo-Elamite fiale on the right, offered at Christie's in London in 2010, is from the same series as the ones with lion curled up. This one, on this occasion, the lion is sprawled over a bull it has killed. A variation on this type substitutes a deer for a bull. Two celebrated examples were recovered from the Athenian Acropolis on the left and the German excavations from Olympia on the upper right. Below a third on the lower right, That one was acquired by Bertolt Thorvaldsen while living in Rome. All three perhaps were made in the same workshop. More than 30 years ago, Glenn Marco charted the transference of the motif of the lion and bull fight from the ancient Near East to archaic and classical Greece. The process can be documented both in the literary and the archaeological records. Diomedes kills 2 Trojans, Echemon and Chromios, like a bull jumping on a bull or heifer. Agamemnon's encounters with Trojans are likened to a lion killing the young of a doe, and elsewhere cattle, all in the same Aristeion. Like the Alcmeonidae of Delphi, the names of the patrons who arranged for the great animal fight pyramids in late archaic Athens may well be familiar to us, although their association with these projects is long lost. They were, however, also the projects for the Kleinkunst under discussion. These 2 classes of bronze handles have revealed the pervasive diffusion of a restricted group of motifs, not just through the decorative arts in all its manifestations, from armor to perfume bottles, but also extending to architectural sculpture. Unlike the metal vessels of the ancient Near East and Celtic Europe, Greek ones tended to be plain. In this respect, they contrast forcefully with their counterparts in black and red-figured pottery. Both the handle types considered today are indebted to the artistic traditions of the ancient Near East, the animal fights entirely so, the kouros handles in the motif of lions, of holding lions by their tails. They too are fully part of the Orientalizing revolution and its aftermath. This tapestry of subjects, however, was not new in the archaic period. Lions, rams, animal fights, and so many others are familiar from the images in Homeric similes. It is from emblems like this, I would suggest, that the landed gentry in archaic Greece liked to construct their public persona in the generations before portraiture was conceivable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that I would like to suggest that there are 2 separate ways of viewing these 2 presentations. That the Greek vases were invited to consider as representative of the activities in the symposium, whereas the metalwork that you've been describing is almost needs to be interpreted in relation to the needs of a quite different society, which was not necessarily interested in the symposium as symposium, but was interested in the prestige of the mode of drinking, and that therefore the symbols on these bronze vessels, which were constructed for the most part by Greeks, reflected the desires of the purchasers for whom they were intended, rather than a particular set of rituals. This is a very puzzling difference in the purpose of these objects, is it not?
I'm not sure about that. I think that a hydria in bronze and a hydria in black figure were ostensibly used for the same sorts of things, maybe on somewhat different occasions. But I think that the Vix crater was made to mix wine and water, or have a good deal of wine, for some sort of party.
Yes, I accept that completely, but my point is rather that a sort of Lissarragian point, that the decoration that we can perceive on vase paintings is decoration which reflects directly an experience of the symposium. Yes. And that's why it can be it could be used to interpret details about the symposium, whereas the metalwork seems to be more distanced.
Yes, absolutely.
It seems to reflect a desire to drink like the Greeks, but not any particular interest in precisely how the Greeks drank, whereas the vases suggest to us that they were fascinated by their own activities.
Yeah.
Would that be a fair presentation? I don't want to discourage others from asking questions either in detail or... Yes, wait.
I'd like to point that found in Ukraine
Yes.
that you showed us, that seems to be slightly different in kind from most of the other precious metal vessels, insofar as it presents actually a very functional, not very ceremonial vessel, a shape that would be typically used for just traveling goods and not for presenting them in front of a public, in front of symposiasts. I wonder whether you have an idea why this shape was turned into the precious material of bronze and not a showing off vessel type.
I think that there may be one or two pointed amphorae in metal here and there. And I haven't thought about this, it's a good question. I tend to, my initial feeling is that sometimes somebody wants to have a vessel in bronze and they order it. And of course, these have to be, I mean, the one that I showed has got this very remarkable sort of patination from the swamp in which it was preserved, but originally it would have been gleaming and polished to look as gold as possible.
To answer a little bit, the amphora, of course, that you see is of precious metal, but it contained precious imported wine in large quantity. And so it was itself a symbol of luxury, of expense and the rest.
To throw another idea into the frame, there is, of course, the very old idea, old ideas are not necessarily bad, that most of these bronze vessels were made as diplomatic gifts from Greeks who didn't use bronze or silver or gold very much to societies which valued them very highly, to societies like the Scythians and the Persians. And that contrasts them with the vases, which were intended, surely, for use, for the most part. Use in an actual ritual which was performed, if not daily, at least as often as possible, by the Greeks themselves for their own pleasure. Yeah. So that there's a sort of mismatch between, on this perception, there will be a mismatch between attributing the meaning of precious metal objects, which reflects the maker's view of the society to which it's to be donated, and the potter in the Keramikos, who is actually trying to please Greek patrons who are going to use it immediately and discuss it in their symposia. They are the ones who will be doing things that François and Daphne have done, asking questions of the vase, here's a new vase. What does it represent?
You're certainly right that many of these vessels did go backwards and forwards around the world, the Mediterranean world, in the context of diplomatic gifts and exchange. But I think that certainly for bronze vessels, there's an awful lot that have stayed in Greece. I mean, huge quantities on the Athenian Acropolis, huge quantities at Olympia, huge quantities at Delphi and other sanctuaries. But I think also in graves, I mean, it's not that the graves are not going to be as rich as the ones in places like Crimea or Italy perhaps, but they exist, and there are a great many of them, and they show up in the historical records. I mean, there were a whole bunch of bronze vessels listed in the confiscations from the Hermocoppidae in the late 5th century, and one shows and a nice hydria is mentioned by Demosthenes, which some slave boy had run away with as collateral in the course of a dispute with his owner. So they're there, and they circulate.
There is a difference in many ways between the bronze vessels and the painted pottery, as you suggest. Painting of images on the vases was easier than creating it on the bronzes. And we do find other vases like the Vix crater, often just in tiny fragments, with a relief on the neck, which adds to the iconography of these sorts of vessels. And, what we've lost when we think about the Derveni crater, what preceded the Derveni crater in terms of decoration?
Well, to the question of cost, Richard Stone, who recently passed away, he was the Sherman Fairfield chair of the conservation department at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And Beryl Bar-Sharai, in her book monograph on the Derveni crater, recorded a conversation she had with him. And in his view, it was going to take at least 6 craftsmen 18 months to put something as complicated as that together. With all due respect to Dick, I think that no patron would wait 18 months. But anyway, it gives one a sense of the amount of labor that repoussé metalwork takes, and that's why in the 4th century you have these little postcard plaques that go on the bottom on hydriae, and you get them on Klappspiegel and that kind of thing.
I'm very aware that as president of this first session, I ought to try and keep to the timetable as much as possible. And we have already overrun by a quarter of an hour. So.
Oui. Donc, s'il n'y a pas d'autres questions, je vous invite de prendre un café à l'extérieur, en haut, oui. Et on reprend à 16h.